to dive into the transforming of the energy landscape. We talked briefly about it, but our next panel is going to delve into the details of how to forge alliances and partnerships with between Middle East, Africa, and Asia. There's a clear need for such alliances. A recent estimate said that almost $79.6 billion of climate finance was mobilized in 2019. And as discussed in the last COP, in COP27, the international community must now deliver on a promise to mobilize $100 billion to support growing economies. To discuss this along with her guests, please help me in welcoming a leader in scaling carbon management into a global industry through climate investment, technology, and client advisory. She's the Vice Chairwoman of Carbon Direct USA, Neely Gilbert. I know she's here. I saw her in the back. Neely, if you can hear me.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Neely Gilbert. I am the Vice Chairwoman of Carbon Direct and also the Chair of the Advisory Board of GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Thank you so much to our hosts and to all of our guests for being here. Looking forward to this discussion today. We have a group of amazing leaders. Please allow me to introduce my fellow panelists. Michael Sharon, who is the former Bank of England Senior Advisor and President and Chief Strategy Office of MVGX. Dr. Nasser Saidi, who is the Chairman of the Clean Energy Business Council of the UAE. And we have with us virtually Dr. Ma Jun, the former People's Bank of China Chief Economist and currently the president of the Institute of Finance and Sustainability in China. So today we're going to be talking about scaling finance for the climate transition, and especially how we scale finance for transitioning in emerging and developing market countries, which is not only one of the most challenging paths that we have ahead of us, but also one of the greatest sources of opportunity. Estimates suggest that by the end of this decade, the world will need to mobilize $1 trillion in annual cross-border financing for emerging markets, just for the energy transition alone. And there will need to be more capital than this for adaptation and resilience, and for other forms of mitigation. So at GFANZ, where we now represent over 650 institutions, financial institutions worldwide, we've been focusing on a few key pillars that I wanted to share before we jump into the discussion. First of all, recognizing that local pathways are different, we've launched regional networks in Asia Pacific, in Africa, and in Latin America, focused on needs specific to those countries and continents. We also have a focus on working with countries where the nations themselves may not have 2050 aligned targets, working with local financial institutions to develop transition finance strategies that are in line with pathways elsewhere in the world. And then lastly, supporting country platforms for finance that focus on partnering with governments on their overall national transition plans to be able to match finance for individual pillars that add up to the national need. Within this, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships in Indonesia and Vietnam are shining lights. So with that, I'd love to turn to the panelists for a discussion about what you're seeing on this topic. I gave some examples of GFANZ, which is one of the non-state actors in the climate movement. Michael, perhaps we'll start with you. Can you tell us what you're seeing in the role of non-government and private sector actors in this space? What types of programs, initiatives, or projects are you most interested in?
Neely, thank you very much. As you've pointed out, it's absolutely essential for the private sector and the non-government participants to be active members in the transition. At this point, there's roughly, and I think even GFAS pointed this out, over 100 trillion of funds in the private market. Now, those funds are parked in stocks, bonds, real estate around the world. And what we need to be able to do, collectively, those that are developers, those that are driving the transition, is to be able to provide the offshore wind, onshore wind, the new battery technology, all of the things that are going to drive that sustainable movement into the energy area. And by being able to do that, we'll be able to start tapping so much of that debt capital markets. But until we get proper investments at scale, and there's certainly the need for it at scale. If you look at our neighbor, we're based in Singapore, Indonesia has great opportunities. There's 60 billion of money sitting around Indonesia right now to help it do its transition. And we need these types of programs throughout the Asia, Africa, and the global south. So I think those are extraordinarily powerful projects, but you need the private sector to be able to provide that senior secured debt and investable projects to invest in.
Thank you, Michael. Dr. Nasser, what do you see in this space?
Thank you. And let me just pick up on where Michael just ended in terms of what's available, but also what we need to do. So far, we have been underinvesting into what is an existential issue, namely our survival. So the amount of funding that we currently need on an annual basis is 5 to 8 times what we're currently investing, just to put that in perspective. Now, let me turn to our part of the world, because we are in a region, in the MENA region, which is the most exposed to climate risk, but is also a region which has plentiful resources, by which I mean there's something like $4 trillion worth available to the sovereign wealth funds of the region that they can invest in climate finance. So I think there are two things that need to happen at a global level. The first one is we've got to stop subsidizing fossil fuel use. The IMF, in a recent report, showed that fossil fuel subsidies, both direct and indirect, in 2022 were $7 trillion. Not 700 billion, $7 trillion. In this part of the world, subsidies last year in 2022 were about 7.8 billion. That's about 26%, if you look at Saudi Arabia, 26% of Saudi GDP went to fossil fuel subsidies. On a global basis, that's 7% of global GDP. So in part answer to the question, we need to do two things. We need to remove subsidies and start using the proceeds of removing subsidies to finance climate change, renewables, and in particular, climate adaptation, that's one part, and impose also a carbon tax. Carbon taxes need to be on the agenda because if you don't price climate risk, you're not going to be able to attract the private sector investment that we like. If I look ahead, the private sector has got to finance 80 to 90% of the climate finance that we need. Governments and the public sector will not be able to do so. And the reason is very simple. If you look at the projections right now of public debt, by 2030, global public debt will be in excess of 100% of GDP. So where are governments and the public sector going to be able to get the financing? Will they be able to run surpluses? Highly unlikely, particularly at a time of high interest rates. So you've got to provide the space for the private sector, and that means pricing climate risk, it means carbon taxation. And then you need to use, coming back to our region, that $4 trillion that exists to go into climate finance. And to my mind, it has to go into adaptation and not mitigation. We've been very good at investing in renewable energy, electric vehicles, and the rest. But the future has got to be in adaptation. We were talking a bit earlier. I don't believe that we're going to be able to make anything below 2.5 to 3 degrees increase in temperatures. I don't think that's going to be possible. So the challenge is how do we adapt to higher temperatures, hurricanes, extreme climate events, which are going to make many of the cities we live in, let alone the countryside, unlivable.
Well, that's a bleak picture, Dr. Nasser. I hope we can figure it out during this panel, what to do. Hello, Dr. Majzoub. Thank you for being here with us today. You've been working for a long time on this topic across government and with private finance. Can you tell us what role you are seeing for non-state actors to contribute to the climate action landscape and some initiatives that you're excited about today?
Thank you very much. Now, let me follow up on what Michael has been saying, the role of private sector, especially on financing. And I personally worked on setting up the Chinese green financial system, and I co-chaired the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group at that time, together with Michael as my co-chair from the UK side, and later on I co-chaired with our US colleague from the Treasury Department. So both internationally and within China, I strongly feel that by mobilizing private sector financing, we need to develop a framework which involves what I call 4 pillars. Number one, we need taxonomies to define green activities clearly in a credible way. Otherwise, we'll end up with greenwashing. In the case of China, we have developed 3 sets of taxonomy, one for green lending, one for green bonds, and one for green projects, including for government financing. And internationally, we've been working on harmonization of taxonomies across jurisdictions, including an effort between China and Europe. I co-chaired, actually together with Marcel Hague from EU, DG FISMA, in launching the Common Ground Taxonomy that's now recognized both by China and EU. The second pillar is disclosure. We need to make sure that the issuers or the fundraisers disclose the environmental climate information so that the investors know whether the project they're investing is indeed green and low carbon. And in this area, the direction is to move towards ISSB-based disclosure for most of jurisdictions. And the third pillar is that we need to provide a range of financial products, including green loans, green bonds, green equity, green insurance products, and many others, so that it can meet the diverse demand from the green economy. And finally, we have to put in some incentives from the government, from the financial regulators, from sectoral regulators, so that we can make some of the green projects, which currently is not very profitable, but make them more bankable, more profitable than otherwise, so that we can attract more private sector financing. In the case of China, we were able to attract a lot of private sector financing through a limited allocation of government resources, including interest subsidies and low-cost funding from a central bank. And in some pilot program, I think the leverage could be more than 10 times or even 20 times, meaning the government putting a little bit of money, and in the blended finance format, it can attract 20 times of a private sector financing. And in terms of scale, let me just give you some numbers. After 8 years of developing the green financial system in China, we now have the largest green lending market with outstanding amount of 27 trillion RMB. And we now have the second largest green bond market with outstanding of 1.7 trillion RMB. And these financing arrangements really supported a very large renewable sector, a very large EV and battery sectors. And going forward, we're going to move towards transition finance, which means that mobilizing more private capital to support transition and low carbon activities in carbon intensive industries, such as steel, cement, and petrochemical.
Thank you for sharing these perspectives, both on the global outlook as well as specifically from China. It will be great to hear more from you about this as we continue. Turning now locally, as everyone knows, we're approaching COP28, which is to be hosted right here in Dubai. And throughout this panel, we're talking about global needs as well as regional pathways and contributions. I mentioned my role as the vice chairwoman of Carbon Direct, where we have found a lot of interest in what is unique about the Emirati COP presidency. And I think for us, it comes back to our perspective that the climate action needs to be interdisciplinary in its focus. And so at our company, we work on carbon management, everything that we do to manage emissions in the atmosphere. And we have a lot of scientists, 60 scientists, but they partner with policy teams, with finance teams, with investors. We have a huge software team, really thinking that one of the ways that we can make the climate movement go faster is by bringing a diverse range of expertise talking to each other all at one time. And so when I think about the COP28 agenda and some of the things that are unique in what Emirati leadership is bringing, this has to do with it. The more central diplomatic role that the UAE can play as a bridge between the East and West, the North and South. The way in this year's COP agenda that finance, yes, we have Finance Day like always, but it's a cross-cutting thematic agenda that looks at the way that finance touches everything that we need to do. Also, innovation and technology as a cross-cutting theme that can help to advance and accelerate all of our goals. So I'd like to ask our panelists about their perspective on the Gulf states and the increasingly active role that they're playing in international politics and finance, and then of course, very high stakes in the energy transition in this region. Dr. Nasser, this time, maybe I'll start with you. Can you tell us what unique role do you see the region playing in our shared climate action initiatives?
Sure, thank you. If you look at COP28, there are 4 major themes. One is on energy transition and making that move forward, but on an integrated basis, looking at supply side and demand side, not just supply. Number 2 is climate finance, but with the idea that climate finance also has to be inclusive. It's not just the emerging markets or emerging economies. You've got to think of everybody whose voice is not being heard at the various COPs. So that, I think, is what we call part of the Global South. Third theme is adaptation. It's not just about mitigation, it's about how you adapt to something that's going to happen in any case. And the fourth, and this is an important one because I don't think it was present in previous COPs, it's about inclusivity. It's about the role of women, for example, the fact that you've got water, energy, and infrastructure all together. So let me mention a couple of perspectives from this region, which I think are going to be important. One, I think, and this is the GCC in particular, over the past 3 to 4 decades, they've developed a lot of climate tech, and I'll mention what these are, which can be exported to the rest of the world. I'll mention 3 of them. One is desalination. 50% of the world's desalination capacity is in the GCC region, 50%. It's been tried and tested. Why is desalination so important? Because by 2050, more than 70% of the world's population is going to be living in cities and urban areas. And the demand for water for all sorts of purposes is going to be rising very rapidly because of the demographics in Africa, Asia, and the rest of the world. It's going to shoot up. How are you going to provide the water? In this part of the world, 80% of the water that we use comes from outside the region. It's a major challenge. So you have to desalinate. It's not just seawater, it's any type of water that you would need to clean. So desalination, I think, is a major area. The other thing is that as temperatures increase, you need to cool yourself, not just as human animals, all the other animals and plants on this planet. So the demand for cooling is going to rapidly rise as well. This part of the world already has district cooling. When we're sitting here, the air conditioning that you're using doesn't come from air conditioning units hanging out of windows. They come from cooling plants. And then the cool water is distributed just exactly like you distribute electricity. So district cooling is a technology that this part of the world can export to other cities and other urban areas. The third is desert agriculture. We're facing increasing desertification in this region. Already last summer, temperatures hit 52 degrees in many of the countries of the region. You cannot survive at 52 degrees, and you cannot grow anything at 52 degrees. So desert agriculture is going to be a major area. So those 3 technologies I mentioned are technologies that can be exported by the countries of the region and financed by the countries of the region. And in particular, I'm an advocate of having that as part of the foreign aid policy of the GCC countries. A very little known fact is that the GCC countries spend 2% of their GDP in aid and grants to the rest of the world. So I'm in favor of directing a lot of that to climate action.
Thank you. May I ask you next, Michael, to share your perspective on the Gulf states?
Well, I think obviously our great hosts here have and embrace this outstanding opportunity to host COP. And as the doctor pointed out, they're front-running what global climate change is all about. The heat here is giving them an opportunity to bring out some of the best technology. And I want to build a little bit on that because the technology isn't just on desalination, it's across the board. It's on energy substitution, it's around winds and solar and other things. So I think that the leading by example, which the UAE is doing here, and being able to develop the technologies that can actually drive the sustainable energy transition is absolutely core. But the other piece to that, which we're talking about, is the financing. Sovereign wealth funds and funds with huge amounts of capital to be able to use the streams coming in from their existing sources to actually fund the transition, both here and globally, is going to be absolutely essential, not for just this region, because as the doctor pointed out, water is going to be so key. Just one quick small anecdote. I was at the Swedish Chamber of Commerce. A young lady had a new pet food, which you'd think, how silly is that? Well, it was made from insects. And if you didn't know this, 37% of all livestock is used for pet food. The amount of water you use to grow the crops to feed to livestock that are fed to your pets is monumental. And the focus around water and the expertise here of the Emirates and the other Gulf states are going to be huge. Water is going to be absolutely essential, and for things like desalination plants, green desalination plants, which get their energy from solar and wind, are going to be absolutely essential around the world, including not just North and South Africa, but Europe and parts of Asia.
This is really the nexus of water, food, and energy. Majun, I'd actually like to ask you to go deeper into this topic, also talking about China and the East. When you look at the Gulf states and the global South, how do you think that these regions can work together with the East to push for more meaningful progress in accelerating financial flows to address the climate challenge?
I think many Gulf states generate a lot of revenue from the oil industry, and indeed, I think many of them are planning to allocate some of the proceeds to green sector, especially for renewable energy, electric vehicles, green buildings, and so on. But I'm hoping that this allocation of oil revenue to green sectors can be done in a more sort of a consistent, structured manner. Which really mean that developing a green financial system with a couple of key pillars. For example, whether the Gulf states can develop a green taxonomy, which is agreed upon by all the members of the region, so that there's a less risk of green washing and more clarity on what money is actually going to and what kind of environmental benefits and carbon reduction benefits are being generated. And secondly, introduction of a disclosure requirement that's consistent with ISSB, which is the International Systemic Standard Board. So I think all these infrastructure level arrangements will help the Gulf states to allocate their money more effectively to the green economy. Now, on specific way of collaboration between China and Gulf states, I think at least 2 areas we can think about. One is China actually produces a lot of cost-effective equipment in the area of solar, wind, electric vehicles and batteries and so on. And the Gulf states need a lot of that for installation in green projects. And I think that area of collaboration could be a quite useful and mutually benefiting arrangements. Which means that a lot of projects can be done in a way of cooperation and maybe in the form of a joint venture between China and Gulf states. The other area of collaboration, which actually I'm now talking to some of the colleagues in the central banking sector, including in Emirates, is about capacity building. And myself has been engaged in sustainable finance capacity building in the past 5 years. We provided the capacity building services to more than 4,000 participants from 70 developing countries already. And we're planning to scale up this effort. And in fact, during the COP, I'll be announcing a new scheme, which is called Capacity Building Alliance of Sustainable Investment. And that's going to involve a lot of member institutions, and it will be sourcing knowledge and distributing such knowledge to a wider network to many developing country emerging markets, including those in the Middle East. And in that areas, I'm looking forward to collaboration with our partners in the Gulf states.
Thank you very much. So I see that we're running out of time. I want to thank again the esteemed panelists. Thank you to our hosts, and thank you all for listening.